Okay, so hello, my name is Jason Bofetti, a Senior Program Officer at the NEH and Team Lead for the Scholarly Editions and Scholarly Translations Grant Program. This webinar will provide an overview of this grant program and provide some additional information about the application's instructions and will be recorded. I will focus largely on programmatic topics rather than on budgetary issues. So if you have budget questions about preparing a budget, this may not be quite the webinar for you. While it's not intended as a complete guide to writing an application, I hope that you will find it helpful. The statements that I make in this webinar will be superseded by anything in the actual notice of opportunity. So please prepare your application using that document. In case I make any mistakes, we have to go back to the actual notice of funding opportunity. So as I said, my own name is Jason Bofetti. I'll be doing this webinar today. We also have a few folks who are joining us today who are part of the program as well, and I'll have each of them introduce themselves, starting with Suha.
Hello, everyone. My name is Suha Katsi. I'm a program officer, and I work closely with the Scholarly Editions and Scholarly Translation grant program. And I've been with the NEH for 2 years, and I specialize in comparative literature. It's a pleasure to be able to help you and to meet all of you. And at the end of the webinar, you'll have our emails, so feel free to contact us. Thank you so much.
And then over to Madison.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Madison Hendren. I'm another program officer in the Division of Research Programs. I've been with NEH myself for just under 2 years, and I work alongside Jason and Suha and Amy with this program. We're happy to have you here.
And Amy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Trotter. I'm the program analyst in the Department of Research for several programs, including the Scholarly Editions and Translations team. We're happy to have you here, and we're happy to answer your questions at the end of this.
Okay, thanks. And then, so if you need to use the closed captioning option, there is a button that you can click. If you go up to the top level, there's 3 dots, and then it says More underneath it. And if you click on that, you can add, which will just happen for your own screen. You can turn on live captions, as I understand it, and that will something you can do if you need that. Okay, so NEH is a federal agency which is funded by taxpayers like you. Our overall funding ratio is about 17%, but it's about 26% in this program. But it's probably closer to the 17% for new projects. We do fund a fair share of returning projects in this program in American history and literature. So there are some that receive a greater percentage of funding from that because of that. And so it is closer overall to that 17% rate. Let me just move over to the disclaimer. This is something mostly for the PDF later. It just says what I already said, which is that if whatever I say here, it's ultimately superseded by what's in the program guidelines. So as you probably already found, if you're already here, this is kind of the landing page for our program, and what I've highlighted here is this the area here on the side for the grant deadlines. And so if you ever need to refer to this, this will not change between now and November 30th, and I'll go over some of these key dates with you now. So the application deadline this year is Wednesday, November 30th, the deadline is at midnight. So you don't want to wait until the very last minute, because some people try to do it very late, and there can be any kind of snafu. And so it's really better to get the application done. If you're doing it that last day, get it done early in the day, because there's a kind of crush, not only for our deadline, but a lot of other people's have deadlines at midnight, and so throughout the federal government. So it's more of it can be a grants.gov issue if you wait until that last minute. We do draft reviews in this program, which are optional. That deadline is coming up pretty soon on September 23rd, and there'll be more about drafts a little later in the webinar. we plan to notify for this program in August of 2023. We have a national council meeting that meets in July, so it's really not until after that meeting that we can make final decisions and that the chair makes final decisions. So that's why we have that roughly August, usually early August deadline, but it can be at some point during that month. And then just for any of these projects that you would be applying for now, the earliest start date would be October 1st of 2023. And then you could start your projects as late as September 1st, 2024. So there actually is, you don't necessarily have to start it as soon as you receive word. There can be a delay, and in fact, it's even possible if you've asked for an earlier start date, you could change that with our permission to make it later in that year if you don't think you'll be able to get started right on October 1st. So what is a scholarly editions? What do we fund in a scholarly? Sorry, what is a scholarly editions project? It's most of the work leading to a scholarly product. This does not include printing or marketing or promotion, though. There are many kinds of projects possible, many kinds of combinations of print and digital. But if you decide not to do any kind of digital, at least explain in your application why. Since many people these days expect things to be digital, at least some part of it to be digital, I think you should make the case that in fact you don't think it's appropriate, or perhaps you don't have the abilities in-house to do them. Just make that clear, since there are so many things that are now going digital. And we're looking to fund things that are inaccessible or inadequate, for scholars, things that are in archives only, things that are only in print in old editions that haven't been updated in many years, or perhaps to current editorial standards. These are the sort of things we can imagine funding, even if there is an existing edition, but perhaps it's not one that scholars have ready access to, or is not in print anymore in any kind of modern form. We do fund editions that would appear in their original foreign language, or those that are in English, or those that are translations from their original language into English. They must contain content that advances humanities scholarship. So it isn't enough for simply classroom use, but these are the kind of texts and works that we would expect would actually advance scholarship, and not just any kind of scholarship, but humanities scholarship. So you need to make a case in your argument in your application for humanities impact. These projects need to involve additional content. So it's not just the straight addition or transcription of something, but it has to have annotations, introductions, some kind of scholarly added value in order to compete in this program. These are collaborative projects. So actually, if you want to do a translation just by yourself, you could apply for an NIH fellowship. Those are one-year projects for $60,000 at tops. But if it's a project that requires more than one person, this would be the program. Even if it's a relatively small project, if it's more than one person, this would be the program for you. And this is a program for institutions, not individuals. So we only fund institutions. There was a time some years ago that in this program we funded individuals. That was as it was pretty rare. But these are institutional grants. And this is a little bit of a change from last year, but this has been true for many years, that we do fund projects at an early stage. So we do fund those up to 2 years for a maximum of $65,000. So the idea is that you cannot ask for the full $100,000 for a planning stage project. And in fact, the most you can ask for is 65, which you could do for 1 year, or 65 over 2 years. But it's a bit more limited budget request. So what makes a project competitive in this program? First, you have to make the case for significance, not just the significance of the person you might be doing an edition of, or the group, but of the actual text itself. How is that text important? Because there are some texts for very important people that aren't very important themselves. And so I think you have to make a case for the text. You have to make a case for what language you want to have it in. Do you want to use the original language? Do you want to keep it in the original, say French or Latin, and then make a case for that? and if you're going to do it in translation, what is the case for translation? Why is it important that that work be translated into English? And you have to make a case in your application for the kind of scholarly content you're going to add, and sort of explain what your annotation policy is going to be, what you're going to add for head notes or footnotes. What is it? What is the value added, and why is it important to that project? We want to see collaboration. We want to see the kinds of the right set of people that have the right skills for the project that you've proposed. We need to see a detailed work plan, who's going to do what when. There's a couple places in the application, both in the narrative and as a separate attachment where you actually explain your work plan. And then we need to have a clear, well thought out product. What is the case? What is the case for print or digital, and how are you going to do that? And then just another thought on work plan. Projects have short-term goals, and there's also projects that have a long-term goal. That is, you may be looking at having to come back to us many times. I think you need to make a better justification for a project that's likely to take many years, just because that's a longer time commitment perhaps, and I think that's important that you're kind of upfront about that this will take time, and then give a good reason why doing something over the course of several grants and the overall corpus is important enough that would justify something that you would likely have to come back for different phases of that project. Okay, so what makes a project ineligible? And by ineligible, I mean projects that will not be reviewed. So if it's a transcription or if you're only digitizing or only transcribing a work and you're not adding more scholarly content, if it's a translation into any other language other than English, this is still a rule at this point. I know there's been some talk about whether we could, in fact, have examples of things that are translated from English into other languages or from other languages into, say, something like Spanish or French. But that's something that we still have not decided to do yet. So for now, it only can be into English. Obviously, any work that's lacking new scholarly apparatus. I've seen projects where they propose that they will be doing a translation or an edition of a previously published work where they're simply bringing over the scholarly apparatus from that work. But in fact, no, you have to add new scholarly apparatus, not just what already existed in the previous work. This is something that we've added to the guidelines just to make it clearer, because some of these projects that were on living authors tended to be uncompetitive, because I think there's a potential here, and our worry is that we would get into sort of the translation business of all kinds of contemporary works. And so we've kind of had to come up with a hard and fast rule for what we don't fund anymore. And so we've decided to make this rule about having an edition or a translation of someone whose work is essentially not completed yet. And so we've left it at living. So these are things that essentially we already know that they finished their work, that there can be an edition of all of their work potentially, and there can be some kind of reflection on their importance. I think it's hard to tell whether someone who's contemporary or still living will have the kind of lasting value that we're looking for their works, and so we've created this rule. And then also we don't fund anthologies or source books that are written primarily for educational purposes, so that they're not for advancing scholarship, but they're for use in the classroom. We tried to split, it's been a long-term issue where we wondered how competitive anthologies are for lots of reasons, one of which is it's hard to know what the corpus is or should be, what the selection criteria should be. But at least for this round, what we're saying going forward is you have to make a case for an anthology that's going to be for scholarly use, that you're trying to consolidate the existing learning and create something that can be used, perhaps collecting things that haven't been collected before. But I think you have to make a case for why those things and why not other things that could have been included, and ultimately for scholars. And then there's also a full list of all the restrictions on page 31 of Notice of Opportunity, which gets me to this next slide, which is where to find the guidelines, as we often called it in the past, or we've more recently started referring to them by a kind of government-wide phrase of a notice of funding opportunity, or the NOFO. This is where I'm pointing you to with the arrow there. This is where you can find the PDF which is the document that spells out the entire process and all the things you need to include in your application, and all of our rules regarding the application process. So you can find it here. Won't go offline, but you probably are already aware of this and probably have already found it. And then also you'll want to look at there's also a little further down, and this is the landing page again. Step 1, you'll find there's also the frequently asked questions, and some people miss that. And this is there as well for you to look at and read through. It might answer some of your questions. Also on that landing page, we've been adding this every year, is to indicate major changes to the program, especially for those who may have applied last year, and you might want to be applying again. And so we do want to list on this. We do list here what are the changes we've made. There's still small changes in the actual document that we don't have here, but this is at least the ones that are kind of the large scale ones that may affect projects. And this is really good for those, again, as I said, who either applied last year or have been applying over a number of years, just to check and see how the program is different. And that is actually, to go back to that slide, that's not the full list, even though I cut it off here at the bottom. It's not, there's more to this page, just so you know. Okay, so let's go over some of those what's new items so that I can talk about them a little bit more. First of all, is this idea of the annual cap has changed slightly. I mean, there's still the same annual cap for $100,000 in outright funds per year, but we're allowing all projects to request up to $150,000 in funding, so long as at least $50,000 of that is in matching funds. The reason why I say at least is that we wanted to make it possible for projects to, in theory, ask for $150,000 in just matching funds. But we still needed to keep the cap at 150 total. So those of you who don't want to do fundraising, we're still at the same $100,000 cap, but now you don't have to be a project that's eligible by what we used to call the More Perfect Union Initiative, which allowed folks to ask for $50,000 in matching if they were eligible for that initiative. Now any project can ask for more matching funds up to a total project cost of $450 over 3 years. If that's confusing, I can try to explain it better later, but let me just move on. As I mentioned a little earlier, that we do have this $65,000 cap for 2 years for planning stage projects. You would need to discuss, and this is true for any project that's asking for matching funds, somewhere there's a place where you need to discuss some of your matching, some of your plans to raise match. We need to see who will be doing that, maybe some ideas of who you're going to go to for this, some kind of a sense that you have a realistic plan to raise the money that you plan to raise, so that we have some confidence that we can give you that money and you'll be able to benefit from it. We now allow some kind of letter of institution. This is your own institution support. You don't have to include this, but I think it's been helpful for some projects, or we think it may be helpful. Just to make it clear that the institution has buy-in on the project, and it can actually be useful for you to get that buy-in in advance, so that you get a letter from a dean, a letter from a president of your institution that says why this project's important to them, and that they do support it. Again, it's optional. We capped the samples this year at a total of 35 pages. That's for all samples, all inclusive. We were getting some sample sizes of people giving us 100 pages of samples, and we realized we just needed to create some kind of hard cap for that, for all samples. As I said earlier, we are no longer permitting anthologies or source books that are for educational purposes only. We are no longer permitting editions or translations of living authors, again, because we can't evaluate the long-term significance, and their life isn't over, so they still may have more to add. And then we are not, we just made it clear in our guidelines this year that we don't fund conferences at the end of the edition to sort of disseminate the edition. You can have a conference or some kind of event during during the planning or during the doing of the work in order to bring people together to do the work, but we don't want to have sort of ending conferences simply to celebrate conclusions or to disseminate. That potentially could be asked for in a different program. That's the other reason. Okay, so now I'm going to give a quick overview of the Notice of Funding Opportunity. The topics that I'll be covering here are largely the ones that are in gold here, and I won't be trying to get to all the sections of the application today, which means I won't be covering probably all the sections that are sort of the appendices and whatnot. There's a lot of detail there, and that would really take a whole other session. And maybe in a future year, we'll do a later one in the year where we go over some of those. Now I'll be mostly focused on these and mostly focused on the narrative and the review process. Also, just to go back there to that slide, so I have these are the pages that these appear on the Notice of Funding Opportunity. So starting off with this, as I've already mentioned, the awards themselves, the total that you could request, the project could cost more and you would have to cost share whatever it costs more, but you can only ask NEH for $450,000 and $150 per year, but that is capped at $100,000 in outright funds, up to $150 if you ask for at least $50,000 in matching funds. And this is for any project that applies can ask for this, again, as long as you explain some way how you're going to be doing the matching. The period of performances are going to be 1, 2, or 3 years. If you ask for some odd number of months, we'll have to prorate that 150 or their 450,000. That's how the grants office tells us we need to do it. And we do not require cost sharing or matching in this program. And again, planning stage projects, you would be asking for no more than $65,000 total and outright. We don't permit any matching for planning stage grants, and it would be for 1 or 2 years. Just an overview of the eligibility, the fact that these are the kind of institutions that are eligible, and the kinds of institutions that are not eligible. So other federal agencies, for-profits, and individuals cannot apply, but these are the types of institutions that we do support in this program. So it can be state governments, it can be obviously most of our applicants are colleges and universities, but it's not just limited to that. You can be nonprofits and apply as well, or tribal governments. This is something that you'll find in the NOFO as well. These are sort of the 3 big no-nos for things that will not get reviewed. So even though it's a little bit scary, it's important to know what the ineligible qualifications are. Obviously, if it's late, we very, very rarely, except usually if something were to occur where there'd be a glitch where grants.gov goes down or something. Otherwise, we do not allow late applications in this program or any of our programs. We will not review applications that are incomplete, non-responsive, or ineligible. So obviously, I guess to make clear what non-responsive means, that means that it's a kind of project that we don't support in this program. So if you're applying for hairdressing school, that's not something that we support in this program. I guess I always use that example because there was an application once that I saw for that, and that would be considered non-responsive because it's not something that this program supports. And then if the formatting is incorrect, which means you exceed the page limits, you violate the formatting instructions, which I'll get to in a minute. Basically we're looking for the portions of the applications to not use fonts that are excessively tiny to be able to take more space. That would be an example of violating format. Word on eligibility. So this is about project directors. We say we want scholars to be project directors, not just administrators. We want people who are going to be working on day-to-day of the projects. We say in the guidelines that we need you to be spending significant time, continuous work. We do get questions about what is significant time. I think it's It's very important that it's certainly continuous work or that you're involved on a weekly basis with these projects. It may be as low as 10 or 20% if there are lots of people on the project. Maybe the project director doesn't do a lot of the day-to-day work, but I think that it should be something that you're more than just sort of overseeing from afar, but are really involved in on an ongoing basis. There's more in the guidelines there about the designation of directors and co-directors. One of the important things that people ask about is, can they be a co-director on more than one project? And you can be. What we're just concerned about is people trying to be directors on more than directors. That is really the ones that are in charge of the project and have to answer all the questions we may have, or if we have questions, I should say, and have to do the reports annually. We only want you to be doing one of those projects for us, one of those sets of reports for us at a time. So one project at a time. And these you don't have to be a U.S. citizen or even a resident to be a project director, but you will want to make a case for why the particular project might have chosen someone who's not at the institution, perhaps, but is maybe the person who ought to be in charge of the project, because these are ultimately institutional grants. You cannot be currently in a degree program, so you can't be working toward your PhD. You have to have that completed, and if you are close to being done, you need to supply some kind of documentation that shows that you're almost finished or that you will be done by the time the grant begins. And then again, as I said, only one application per project director per deadline. Again, this is because we don't think it's possible to be, or you should be trying to run more than one additions project, certainly at a time. Which means, in fact, no overlapping awards. We also don't want you sort of applying every year for a different project and trying to say do as many as 3 at a time. We want to have clear, no overlapping award time periods. So I'll be mainly discussing this narrative section now in the application, which starts on the discussion of that starts on page 7. We won't be getting to the budget or the application components in this discussion, or the attachments. That would take too long. It wouldn't give us time for question and answer. So now there's a on page 6, the formatting instructions are there for really the whole application, although it certainly has a lot to do with the narrative part of the application. So the narrative itself, not the whole application, but the narrative is 12 pages. It has to be single space, 1-inch margins, 11-point font. There are some suggestions about which fonts to use. You're not limited to sort of Times Roman or something like that. And we're not going to be going through and actually checking the font size, but we will be eyeballing it. We're trying to just keep folks from making fonts too small to try to squeeze an extra page or two out of it. And it's important to note too that these narratives don't have to be 12 pages. It may be possible, especially for sort of planning stage, early stage projects, where you might only need 6 or 7 pages to make the case for your project. And so it is a maximum amount, and we don't fault projects for having shorter narratives if you're able to cover the material in less time, perhaps because it's less complicated. Each of these sections of the narrative itself has suggested page counts. So you'll see significance and impact, 2 pages, and these are basically all roughly 2 pages for each of the sections, except for the part of the narrative where you talk about your work plan. That's about a page. So it gives you less than 12 pages to work with. It might take a little more, a little less on a section, but this this section where we discuss the narrative is found on page 7 through 11 of the notice of funding opportunity. As you'll see in a minute, this is the review criteria. They roughly match the sections of the narrative, so they kind of get evaluated there. You can find, I'll talk about these review criteria in a minute, but the full list of the review criteria and the wording is on page 31. And just to show you, even in the NOFO itself, we actually do list the narrative sections, so you can see where the review criteria lines up with the narrative sections of the application. And you can find that chart on page 12. So I'll be talking about the review criteria and then the selection process for how reviews get done. This was not something that I included last year where I talked about the review process. But let me go through the review criteria. First being significance. This is in many ways the most important criteria. This is where you make your case for the humanities audience that you need to identify for your project, and the case that that this project can stimulate new research by your edition. How the material itself is significant. Again, not just the figure or the group of who might be the authors of these things, but what is it about the material itself? Number two, method and execution. This is in many ways the most complex of the criteria. This is where you're being evaluated on both your choice of selection criteria. If you're not going to do like an entire work or you're going to do several works, how did you make the choice of what to include and what not to include? Your editorial practices, your translation practices. Then clarity of expression. This is about the use of jargon. We tell folks to avoid too much jargon in the application because this is being reviewed by an interdisciplinary panel. Only the kind of academic jargon that you absolutely have to use for the sake of your understanding your project to your audience. And then this criteria bears on the quality of the annotations in the sample that you provide, and also your translation sample. So those are being evaluated as well. Is it a quality sample? Do we get a sense for the sample for why you've decided to annotate what you've annotated, and how you've chosen to translate your text? The third, this is the criteria of the collaborators criteria, the qualification, expertise, and levels of commitment of the project director and collaborators. The purpose of this program is to support time to work on these projects, and so I think making the case that and perhaps isn't everybody has the same level of commitment, but how is the budget being used essentially to free up time for folks to be involved? It may be the case that you may have plenty of research time, and what you're asking for is to be able to pay for the time of others who are working on the project, and make that clear, perhaps even in the narrative, that this is part of why you've chosen to come to NEH for a grant, is that even though you may have the time to do the project, you have others who do have to be paid in order to do, say, some of the lower level editorial work or technical work, and this is where you want to talk a bit about that, perhaps. Fourth, work plan and productivity. And this is probably the most difficult criteria from our reviewers to evaluate. That is, how likely will this project get completed within the time frame? Will it get done? Is it overly ambitious? Is it perhaps not possible to get this done in a time period that can count against you? But also this question of whether it's financial, whether the budget is reasonable. There's a little bit of subjectivity there, but I think is this a good use of funds is kind of the ultimate way this is often judged. And again, as I say, this in some ways is the most difficult for our reviewers to evaluate. And then publication goals is the fifth criteria, and this is in many ways the most important long term. What is the sustainability of the project, whether it's print or digital or a combination of both? It's probably the case that in certain ways print and books are in fact more sustainable projects, because we know they'll be in 10 years, probably in libraries. Whereas I think you have to make a stronger case and talk a little bit more about how you're going to make a project sustainable, both in terms of its costs, and also in terms of its evolving technology for a project that's digital. What is your sustainability plan So that's something that we help to support, is able to last beyond the initial phase of production. And then let me talk a little bit about our application review process. So this is what happens after you've submitted your application. We find 4 to 5 outside reviewers who are new each year, who will review each application. You should probably assume that these are non-experts in your particular field, even though there may be one person in that panel who is an expert. And we try to find, if it's a translation project, we try to get as many of the languages that are on the panel covered by folks who do translate in that language or have editorial experience in general. So we try to get a mix of those who have editorial experience and perhaps those who are users of these sort of products as well. And as I said, we try to cover as many of the languages as we can as possible. And so we generally have been having 4 to 5 panels. So that shows you that if we get 70 or so applications, we tend to have about 10 to 15 applications per panel. So yours will be one of between 10 to 15 being reviewed by 4 to 5 reviewers. And these are panels that are interdisciplinary. Because we don't get enough to have something, say, just in French language. It might be something where there's French, Italian, and Spanish on the same panel, or there might be something in American history and literature, not just American history. So there is cross-disciplinary here, and so you want to think about that you are writing for an audience that might not know this particular area as well as perhaps another panelist will. And as I like to point out that, in fact, that panelists each year will not know that you've applied previously. So that can be true. If you haven't been funded in the past, they won't know that. And because these are new every year, you're making a new case to potential reviewers each year. And then I am getting close to the point where we'll get to question and answers. The last thing I wanted to talk about today is about the draft review process, or about draft reviews. So you are able to submit a shortened version of your narrative, essentially, by September 23rd. So you're probably already aware of that if you saw the guidelines, but this is coming up this is 2 weeks from today. These are also due by midnight of that day. These are optional. You do not have to submit a draft for review by staff, but we can give you feedback that can help you prepare your application. We're able to tell you how you might craft your idea a bit better before you go to full review and before you go complete your application. This is not shared or used at all in the review process, and people who are on the panel will not know whether or not you've submitted a draft to us. I find that the draft review is really most helpful for first-time or unsuccessful applicants. So this is really geared. This is geared more toward them. Although anyone who's submitted before, even if you've been funded before, you can come back. You can give us a draft. But if you are applying again, so if you applied last year, even if you're unsuccessful, we want you to start with considering the comments that were given to you by your panelists last year. And so if you haven't already requested those, you can still, you're able to request those, and we will send you those, and you can review what last year's panelists said about your application, hopefully improve on that, and then incorporate those into your draft this year. And so these drafts are sort of a maximum. They are a maximum of 6 pages. This is really a very rough draft of your narrative, and this we want to hear about hear the basics of your project. And so there's a list of things. If you go to this page 20, what did I say? Page 29. There's a list of things we want to see in these drafts, and what stage your project is at. And because you don't provide a budget, you'll need to talk a little bit about how you foresee NEH funding supporting this project. So what is the funding essentially going to support? Is it staff time? Is it something else? Is it travel? You need to talk a little bit about that in the draft, because we don't do budget review in this stage. Some of the conditions of the draft review. So one draft per project, one draft per deadline per year. if you haven't if you previously applied either successfully or unsuccessfully, we want you to provide us with a cover letter to the draft explaining some of the changes that you made, so we can kind of drill down to the things that are different about your project now to make it clearer. And then if we will review these in the order that they come into us. So the sooner you provide us with a draft, the sooner we'll be able to return them around. We'll be sending out most of these during the month of October, sending them back to you. And our goal is to have all of them back to you by November 1st. If we get a bumper crop, perhaps we won't make that deadline, but our hope is that we'll be able to get through them all, and that'll be our goal to get them back by that date. So with that, I wanted to pause here, stop here really, and have your questions from you. And so now, if you want to use the chat to ask questions, this is the time to do it. We'll have my colleague Amy will look at the chat, and we'll have, because the recording won't contain the chat, she'll have to sort of ask your question to me so that we get it, so that we can get it answered for the sake of the recording. So Amy, if you want to start fielding some questions for us, I'll try to answer them.
All right, thank you, Jason. We have had one question come in. Todd asks, what if only the one project director's activity is sustained full-time for a year and the other collaborators are part-time and less clearly sustained for a full year?
Yeah, I mean, we do permit, if I understand your question, we do permit various levels of commitment. What we wouldn't want to see is where the money is going to only one person for the entire time. If there are other staff involved who are part-time versus the person who's full-time, if they're being paid, so they're on the budget, they have a clear role to play in the actual editorial work. So what we would not want to see is someone who's sort of full-time and then has sort of a secretary assistant or paying a grad student to do something. That to me wouldn't be fully collaborative. So we want to see the folks who have a secondary or perhaps part-time role sort of also very involved in the content of the project, even if they are part-time.
All right, thank you. We have another question that's a little bit project specific from Douglas Murray, so I'll try to make it a little more generic. They're wondering if they could digitize their pre-web publications that were from more than 50 years ago. Would that be eligible?
When you say, I guess, pre-web, so you're talking about publications that don't have a digital copy somewhere.
Yes,
so
and
something
it
that's
looks
print.
like they are usually data or modeling analyses with some seminal work.
I mean, I guess the two things there, you might want to talk to me separately. Maybe we could do a call later. But I mean, two things I wonder about. One, if it's digitizing only, that would not be right for this program. We do have a humanities resource program in our division of preservation access that deals with projects that are essentially a sister program to this one or brother program to this one, where it's digitization only with no added scholarly content. But also it might matter what the content is. So you say some of the things are housing discrimination, modeling government transfer programs, healthcare policy. There probably is a question about how humanities content is that, and is that appropriate for the NEH? When we start getting into policy studies, either doing policy studies or projects that are additions of policy studies, I think we start veering into an area that we would regard outside of our lane. As an agency. So you might have to tell me more about that, maybe separately.
Thank you. We have someone else asking if outside reviewers is the same thing as panelists.
Yes. Maybe I shouldn't be using terminology that's different from what we typically say. So we usually talk about our panelists. So when we have panels in March, those are panelists, those are outside reviewers. Those are the same thing. Yes, there was actually long ago, we actually had outside reviewers where we would send an application to just one person and get their one person's feedback as a quote unquote reviewer. We don't do that anymore. All projects go to several people and they all review the same applications together.
Thank you. We have another question. Is there still a requirement that collaboration be balanced between domestic and international scholars? For instance, if the PD were going to be doing half the work and they're American and they have 2 UK collaborators, would they need to get a fourth from the US to balance it?
Yeah, we had tried for a while to create some kind of language that would make it clear that we wanted some kind of balance between US and UK, perhaps folks or US international scholars. Part of that was because we didn't want these projects to become perceived as simply pass-throughs to sort of what really were non-US projects. So even though we don't have that language anymore, we've taken that out. I think the idea is that you still sort of respect the general principle that we want to have a mix. If you're involving international scholars, that you also are involving US scholars, but we're not going to be policing that quite the way we had in the past because it just became impossible to come up with language that worked the way we hoped it would. And so I think we certainly these are US-based projects. You can't apply unless you're a US institution. There are some US institutions overseas that have that type of status. And we certainly encourage and if you want to have international participation, that's fine, but we won't be quite policing that line, the 50-50 or equitable balance in quite the same way we had in the past.
Okay, thank you. Could you talk a little bit more about what defines a planning stage? For instance, if a translation has not yet started, but most of the planning has been done, is that eligible?
Yeah, I mean, that seems more like, it doesn't seem quite as like a planning stage. If you look at the program description, sort of the first major page of the narrative, we talk about some of the activities you might be doing in a planning stage project. The idea is that planning stage projects typically didn't seem to compete well in the past because they seem to be so different from the other projects, or projects at an early stage tended to not do well because they weren't as well advanced. We wanted to create the idea that a project could come to us for less money when they weren't really ready yet. Something could still be a planning stage project to me if there still were questions that had to be answered about how you wanted to do the edition. So it could be that you're still trying to decide on your editorial policies or still need to figure out where all the documents are. But I think if you're at the point where, yes, you've got all those questions answered and really it's a matter of starting the work, to me that would not be a planning stage project. But that doesn't mean that you have to come to us for 3 years. You could come to us and say, we want to get started. We would like a year of support in order to sort of start the process and start doing the translation, but we're not ready to sort of commit to a 3-year, $450,000 project. That's still eligible. And so I would certainly encourage you, if you don't feel you're ready to run yet, to come to us for a more modest project at its early phase, so that you could sort of establish a track record. Any other thoughts by any other either Suha or Madison on this point? Whether you've seen anything kind of in a planning stage that you think was a good example?
Yeah, I don't really. Go ahead, Suha.
Madison, please go ahead.
I was really just going to say, I think you covered it, Jason, pretty well. I don't have anything to add.
Yeah, me too. I think, yeah, you've covered the most important aspects. And maybe later on, yeah, we can add some samples on our website. But for now, I think, yeah, what Jason covered and mentioned is sufficient.
Yeah, we haven't funded many planning stage projects. I think we usually get one a year that we're able to fund. And that's not because we're trying to fund one per se, but we get few. We get maybe 5, say, overall. And so it is sort of a struggle to fund more if we don't get enough. And so that's sort of where we're at there.
Okay, thank you.
go ahead with the question.
Sure. So we have another question asking if it's possible to send in a sample in a digital format, for example, online annotated edition and translation of a bigger corpus, and if so, how might the page limit be applied?
Yeah, we've talked about digital samples and we haven't come up with a good solution yet, partly because we're limited by what grants.gov can take in. As I understand it, we're not at the point yet where grants.gov can incorporate digital. If that's incorrect, please send me an email and maybe we can figure out a way to do that. But at the moment, we're not able to take digital in the sense that they're, so you're basically having to do screenshots. You're sort of left at the doing screenshots phase and being able to put something into a PDF. And it's also a problem on the end where we're keeping records, where how do we keep a digital record of something that is live digital content? We don't have a way, as I understand it, although we've talked about it. How does our system incorporate that kind of thing as a digital record?
Okay, thank you. We have another question regarding funding. How does funding work for projects that have several different members at different institutions?
How does funding work?
Mhm.
Is that what the question was? Right. So it's probably a question you'll get more detail on if you ask our grants office, but you have to include budgets for each subgrantee institution, and the institution that's applying has to take responsibility for the total financial responsibility for the project, and then they have to oversee the subgrantees, the subawards that then come as separate budgets. So you have to include, I think there's a way on the budget form to include subgrantee budgets. So there could be more than one budget or something like that. But that's a little bit more in the weeds on how the budgets work than I want to get into right now. But that's roughly how we have to handle it.
All right, we have another question that kind of deals with this concept of multi-institutions. If a project moves institutions, or if the PI does, can they continue working on the project after leaving the institution?
As long as the institution that received the award is willing to let a project director work somewhere else and still lead the project, you can do that. The ideal situation is someone starts at institution A who applies, they find out in the summer that they're moving to institution B, and even before the award starts, we're able to work it out with institution A and institution B talking to each other, in which case institution A agrees to turn the project over to institution B. So they're just a clean transfer even before we make the award. Sometimes it happens though where someone finds out in year 2 that they're changing institutions, then they have to get both institutions to agree to let institution A transfer to institution B. And that does happen from time to time, generally without acrimony and generally pretty easily, but it is paperwork.
Changing topics. Can you explain how to submit a draft proposal?
Yes, you would send it. That's a good question. I didn't cover it. It's in the NOFO, but you send it to editions@neh.gov as a document. It can be a PDF, it can be a Word document, however you want to send it to that mailbox, so that ideally they're coming into the same place so we can just keep track of everything, rather than send it to a program officer. Send it to that editions, which is listed there on the screen, editions@neh.gov, and we will put it on our spreadsheet and then send back to you some kind of note, with our draft response. By email, I should say.
Sorry.
The deadline, September 23rd, 2 Fridays from now. And if you're watching this, it's obviously not 2 Fridays from now. It's whenever you're watching this. But other questions?
Looks like that's all we have in the chat for now.
Okay. Yeah, the only other topic I wanted to raise is this. I mean, it's a big topic, and that's the question of who is a scholar, right? There's a scholarly editions, and I think that you know, I think we want to have as broad an understanding of what scholarship is and who a scholar is. We're not just talking about academic audiences. We're talking potentially about scholars who are not necessarily in sort of academic careers per se, but who may be doing research, you know, in a whole range of type of opportunities and places. And so I do want to make sure we keep this program open, you know, to scholars in many different forms. I see there's one more question there about co-PIs. Are co-PIs allowed? Right. So the way that we handle all projects is one person has to sort of be answerable for things like reports, has to lead the project. You can have as many co-PIs theoretically as you would want, but those individuals would not be sort of the ones responsible for reporting and would ultimately be the ones that we would interface with or talk to if we have a question. So, and as I said, co-PIs can actually be co-PIs on more than one project. Someone who is a project director on one project could without becoming ineligible could be a co-PI on another project that's applying the same year. But only one co-PI, only one PI per project per year is our rule. Okay, well, we're almost at 3 o'clock. I don't mean to shut it down right at 3 o'clock per se, but if we have any other questions, I'd be free to answer them. But one thing I will say is that you all are certainly can email us. We can set up a time also to talk if you have questions, if you want to talk about your project and get an idea if it's eligible, get an idea if it's competitive, or if you have other questions about technical details, send it to us by email or you can contact us. You can call us as well. So I do encourage you to be in contact with the program officer, and we will certainly like to answer your questions. So you know, feel free to do that. And I just want to thank you all for being here. You know, appreciate that you taking the time, and I hope this has been helpful to you. Thank you.